Welcome back everyone. Today we are going to be covering the second round of the FTX Crypto Cup being played in Miami, Florida. Now yesterday we covered the games with Hans Niemann, a rising American junior player who suffered a very tough loss against Jan Krzysztof Duda from Poland. Now today he played against the world chess champion Magnus Carlsen. Now to put the match in perspective, in the first game Hans won a very nice game with the black piece in the Rosslimo Sicilian. You will be seeing some clips which we're putting together of Hans's reaction after the game, where he made a very famous comment in quote unquote I let the chess do, or the chess speaks for itself. Sorry, that was the exact phrase. The chess speaks for itself. So Hans won the first game, a huge win with the black pieces. In the second game, unfortunately with the white pieces, he lost, which takes us to the third round game between Hans and Magnus, the third in the best of four, and we'll jump right into the game. So Magnus playing with the white pieces, lost the first one, won the second one with black. He starts out by playing a3. Now this is known as the Anderson opening. There are many ways that you can follow up. Magnus in the past has actually played moves like 1a4 against Timur Rajbov in a game which went a4, e5, e4. Magnus would go on to win that game. In this game he plays the move a3, which is sort of a semi-troll. Now a3 itself is not a terrible move. However, in many cases you're still going to end up playing c4, d4, e4, and it's going to transpose into a more normal opening, except you've wasted a tempo on a3. However, in most cases that doesn't really change a whole lot. It just means that you can't claim an advantage. So after a3, Hans plays d5 here, and now we get d4. It's worth noting that if black were to play say e5 for example, after c4 we get a transposition into the English opening, and here white is actually completely fine, and this is just normal theory. White will follow up with knight c3 or e3. So Hans plays d5, and now we get d4 being played here by Magnus, and now in this position we get knight f6, knight to f3 is played here, and now we get bishop to f5. Now I did realize, you guys, that as I'm doing this recording, that we do have a slight issue, which is I have this listed as round one. However, of course this was round two, so I apologize for that. I'll make that slight change on the fly. So after bishop f5 we get pawn to c4 being played here by Magnus, pawn to c6 by Hans, knight c3, e6, and now we've actually transposed into a Slav opening, except for the fact that white has played a3. So here Magnus plays knight h4. It's worth noting that one of the main lines in the Slav defense, we go back to the very start with d4, d5, c4, c6, knight to f3, knight to f6, knight c3, is that we do have some lines like this where e3, e6, knight h4 is played. However, in the game, as we see, white has played a3, e6, and then knight h4. So it's a little bit different here with the a3 move being played as opposed to e3. So after knight h4, bishop g4 is played by Hans, f3 played by Magnus. A little bit of a dubious choice here. Now I do suspect that Magnus was trolling a little bit. More normal would have been to play h3, bishop h5, and then a move like g4 here, and after bishop g6 white can take and play either g5, e3, or even potentially maybe bishop g2 here, and white is actually quite a bit better according to the computer. Magnus, I think, was trying to troll a little bit here. He wasn't really like looking for the optimal strategy, in my opinion. I think he was trying to really tilt Hans. So he plays f3, bishop h5, and now he takes on d5, pawn takes, and now he plays g3. Another strange move here, by the way. In this position it would make more sense to play e3 and bishop d3, but he goes g3, knight c6, and now he plays the very extravagant move knight to g2. Hans plays queen b6, which is a move that I like here. We get pawn to e3, bishop to d6, just normal development here by black. Black is going to castle, and then at some point look to play e5 and break the center wide open. So knight f4 is played by Magnus. Hans goes bishop g6, get knight takes bishop, pawn takes, and now let's move king f2. It's an important move because if white plays a move like, let's say, bishop d3, black can go bishop takes g3 check. If you capture after rook takes h1, black will be up a rook for a bishop. And if you play a move like bishop g2 to guard the rook in case black were to take and take, after bishop g2, black is the very nasty move rook takes h2, rook takes h2, bishop takes g3 check, attacking the king and the rook. And after you move the king, bishop takes h2. Black simply has two extra pawns on g7 and g6, and the position is completely winning. So Magnus plays king f2 here, guarding the pawn on g3 with the king. Also, there's an idea to maybe slide the king to g2 and then move the bishop and the rook. So for example, if I've just played some random waiting moves for black like a6, king g2, and let's just say rook b8, just ignoring the exact moves, after bishop d3, rook a8 for example, white can now move the rook to the center and prepare e4 because the king is guarding both h2 and g3 here. So there is some merit to playing king f2. So in this position, after king f2, a6 is played by Hans, just a logical waiting move, stops knight b5. Also potentially later you can play b5 yourself. Magnus plays king g2, Hans decides to castle here, and now Magnus makes a very strange decision play the move pawn to g4. Now the computer actually argues that after pawn to f4, white is completely fine because of the ideas involving h4, g4, and potentially h5 trying to attack on the king side. Additionally, one other important factor to f4 is that it stops black from being able to strike in the center with pawn to e5 here. Magnus, however, decides to throw all caution to the wind and plays g4 here pretty quickly, I might add as well. We get pawn to e5 by Hans, a logical move here. In the general principles of chess, one of the things that we do teach people if you're new to the game is that if your opponent plays a wing attack, which is they start to push pawns on the edge of the board, say it's the a file or the b file or potentially a g and the h file, normally the best way to meet a wing attack is to try and attack in the center of the board or open up the pawn structure. So after g4, we get pawn to e5 played here by Hans, g5 played by Magnus attacking the knight. Hans goes pawn takes pawn. Magnus has to take back. If he were to play this move knight a4, this looks like a very nice move because you attack the queen and the knight is still under attack. However, black is a very tricky move. Queen to d8, pawn takes knight, and now the in-between move pawn to b5, which actually traps the knight on a4. You can't go to b6 or c5 because the queen covers b6 and the bishop on d6 covers the c5 square. You also can't go back to c3 because of pawn on d4 capturing the knight on c3. And so this is simply lost, primarily because you're losing the extra knight you have, but also your king is very open here. Black is going to be attacking very, very quickly. So instead, Magnus takes back. We get knight to h5. The knight goes to the rim, but there is an access point on f4, so the knight can jump right back into the game. Now here we get knight takes d5 by Magnus, and Hans makes a huge mistake here. Now the move that Hans plays is not in and of itself a bad move. Black still retains a big advantage, but the problem is that in this position, sometimes you need to step back and evaluate where exactly are the pieces placed, and are your pieces better than your opponents? Do you want to trade pieces or keep pieces on the board? Now in a rapid or blitz game, it's very hard to fault Hans for this move because again, you don't want to spend too much time. He was getting blitzed by Magnus and Magnus was moving really quickly. However, if Hans had used some time here and taken some stock in the position, he probably should have played queen d8. Now the reason is sort of twofold. First of all, after queen takes pawn, which happens in the game, queens come off the board, which means the king on g2 is relatively safe. And then secondly, if we look at this position after queen d8, you'll notice that now queens are on the board. The white king is kind of open here. I mean, it's safe for the time being, and white temporarily is up a pawn. But if we look at the development here, you'll notice that white has 1 2 3 4 5 pieces that are not developed here. So 5 of white's 8 pieces are on their original starting squares. The knight is really the only developed piece, although again, without any pawns around it, you don't even have an outpost. The knight is very vulnerable as well. And so if Hans had played queen d8 here, computer says that after a move like bishop c4, knight to e7 takes, queen e7 here, let's just say rook e1 for example. After queen c7, black is winning because the queen and the bishop target the pawn while the queen targets the bishop. And if you move the bishop after bishop takes h2, now there are all kinds of problems with queen g3, maybe bishop f4, even knight f4 in the right circumstance. So therefore, in this position after knight d5, if Hans had played queen d8, it would have been very interesting to see how the game would have continued, because the computer actually gives us this 2.38, meaning it's completely lost, right? Not just worse, but completely lost. Instead, Hans plays queen takes d4. We get the trade of the queens, and now rook b1 is played by Magnus. We get rook f d8. Now black is still a little bit better here because again, this f4 square is very weak. Black can maybe put a knight here or a bishop here. Additionally, black can get the rooks to the center of the board very, very quickly, but you still have to be quite precise. So Magnus plays bishop d3, very logical move. It develops the bishop, but more importantly, you can now put the bishop on e4. So if I play like bishop f8, bishop e4, now the knight on d5 is consolidated, is protected, and I'll go bishop e3, kick this knight back, and then bring my rooks to the center immediately to illustrate the point. Let's say we get this position. And if we get here, white is actually already quite a bit better because the knight on d5 is really well placed. The knight on h5 is actually now completely out of the game. It can't get back in easily, and white will actually be able to play on both the c and d files. And the third and final point is white also has the bishop pair here, so there always are threats on the diagonals. So after bishop d3, we get rook a c8. Now the only way for Hans to maintain the advantage here was to play the very sort of counterintuitive move bishop e5, bishop to e4, and now let's move knight to e2, because now the knight on h5 is getting back into the game immediately, and white still is not completed the development. If white plays a move like bishop e3 for example, black is now winning after rook d5, bishop takes d5, knight f4 check, and if you move the king, knight takes bishop, black simply has a knight and a bishop for the rook, and it's game over. And after bishop let's say bishop e5, bishop e4, knight e2 happens, the only way for white to not really be completely lost is to play rook d1, knight takes, rook takes. But after bishop takes b2, rook b1, bishop a3, rook b7, while black has an advantage, white can maybe save the game eventually, although I still wouldn't want to play this with white. At any rate, Hans in time pressure here plays rook a c8, rook d1 played by Magnus, and now after knight e6, bishop to e4, Hans needed to really try and bail out here with a move like bishop to e5 followed by knight f4. Knight e7 doesn't work, by the way, because after king f8, if knight c8, rook d1, black is winning, and if you trade the rooks, the knight has to come back, and now we walk into the same tactic with knight f4 winning the bishop. Instead, Hans plays king f8 here. We get bishop to d2, and now Hans plays knight hf4. Now this move makes a lot of sense on the surface, because what you're doing is you're getting rid of this knight on the rim. Additionally, you're forcing white to trade off some knights here. The problem is that after knight takes king f1, white maintains the bishop pair here, and you always have some problems on this diagonal. Additionally, you have to be careful because both the rooks are on the d file, d1 and d8. And the other problem is that white can also maybe play rook c1 at some point, or even bishop a5 to target the rook. So the two bishops are really good, and even though this knight on f4 looks really nice, it's only protected by the bishop, and there really are no targets for it, so it's going to have to go back at some point, and white is already quite a bit better here. So Hans plays b6, we get bishop to b7 played, and now rook b8. Magnus plays bishop b7, we get rook b8. Black cannot move the rook to c7 because after bishop takes f4, you cannot recapture because you lose the rook on d8. And so you have to go here, and now white is simply up a pawn here, and white keeps the two bishops on the board, and this is already very unpleasant. So knight e6 is played here by Hans, bishop c4 played by Magnus, and now Hans plays knight d4, trying to keep the knight alive. Probably he should have taken this pawn, but again, it's very hard to play a move like this, because after takes, first of all, you worry about a move like f4, bishop g3, king g2, bishop h4, and then I want to say bishop e3 followed by rook h1, or followed by king h3 to illustrate the point. Say you go rook c8, white can go king h3, trapping the bishop here. There are no squares. Or for example, say you trade and go king e7. Now I can play rook h1, rook h8, and very simply bishop f2, which will win material. So bishop takes h2 is probably what should have been played, because after takes f4, black does have e5 to open up the diagonal, and the bishop's not getting trapped. Again, Hans was very low on time here, so it's hard to fault him, but it's very easy to be afraid of this. So instead he plays knight d4. Now he's targeting both the pawns on f3 and h2. You get king to g2 played by Magnus, guarding both pawns. Now it's worth noting that very unfortunately bishop takes h2 does not work, because on first glance you think that, well, takes, you can take, and now you get the fork, and after knight d2, black is simply up one pawn here, and he should be close to winning. Maybe it's not clean, but it should be good. But after bishop takes h2, unfortunately white has the in-between move bishop b4 check, and if you move the king, I take, and when you take, there's no bishop here, so I can move the king, and now I simply have two bishops for a knight, and this is easily winning for white. And if you block with the bishop, now I can play rook takes knight, bishop takes bishop, rook takes rook, rook takes, pawn takes bishop, and I simply have an extra bishop, and I should be winning. So after king g2, we get rook b c8 played by Hans, and now Magnus finds a very nice move, bishop a6, a little wrinkle move. The point is that now if black tries to infiltrate with rook c2, you can go bishop d3, rook has to go back, and now after a move like bishop e3 followed by bishop e4, white should be close to winning. And after rook c7 here, Magnus plays the move bishop c3. Now this is actually a shocking move from the standpoint that it actually gives black some slight chances of maybe saving the game. A better move here would have been to play this very unusual move, rook b c1. Now it's easy not to want to play because you worry about something like takes and knight b3, but if black trades, you can take with the bishop, and there still are problems on this d file for black to deal with. So this would have been simpler. Instead, bishop c3 is played, and now Hans plays knight e6. Now on first glance you think, well, what's the big deal? Knight just goes back, targets a pawn. You can very simply protect with h4. However, if you do play h4 here, black has a very sneaky move, bishop takes a3, because now the knight guards the rook, and after you trade, if you take the bishop on a3, I take your bishop on c3, and just like that, we're back to even material here out of nowhere. However, one thing that I've also alluded to many times in the past is that Magnus has a very good spidey sense. So one thing that Magnus is very good at doing is at these critical moments, somehow he's able to stop himself from making a move. He's able to slow it down and think, and true to form, Magnus here does not make his next move quickly. He actually thought, I think, for about 2 minutes before playing this move a4. And the reason he did it is because he realized he had made a mistake, and the idea is how do you keep the winning chances alive and not make a blunder? So he plays a4 here, and now Hans plays a strange move, which is king e7. Now, again, I cannot fault Hans for playing this move because it's a very human move. To play a move like knight takes g5, which computer likes, it feels very scary for many reasons. First of all, you worry about bishop b4 with this pin of the bishop on d6. You also worry about rook takes bishop b4. And you're just worried that after king e7 there might be something like rook d1, and it just feels very, very unpleasant. Again, with plenty of time to think, I suspect that Hans could have found these moves, but he was already very, very low on time, and so he just figures there's something wrong, and he plays king e7 to hold all the glue together. Now if he had played knight g5, the way that I think the game probably should have continued would have been takes bishop b4, something like rook c5 here, and after takes bishop c4, white is quite a bit better. Computer actually only gives us this +1, but as a human here, I'd be very, very scared. The bishop is very well placed. You can actually protect it with b3, and now you have this a pawn that can run up the board really, really fast here. Computer obviously will save this game with no worries, but for a human, I think practically speaking, it's almost impossible to save this endgame with this a pawn. So Hans goes king e7 here, and now we have h4 guarding the pawn because now there's no bishop takes a3. Now knight f4 is played, king to f2. Hans goes back, so we're just trying to wait and hopefully something good will happen. Magnus goes bishop b5, a very nice move, just guards the pawn at a4. White can sort of take all the time that he wants to sort of develop the rooks on d3 or d1, and black inevitably is going to end up losing. So Hans plays rook h8, get rook h1 to guard the pawn, bishop c5, king g3, check, king g2, and now Hans again goes knight f4, king f2, bishop c5, king g3, and knight back to e6. And now Magnus plays rook e1, again just improving the rooks, getting the optimal setup. Bishops on b5 and c3 are perfectly placed. The pawn on a4 guards the bishop on b5, pawn on b2 guards the bishop on c3, and now you eventually want to do something either on the e file or on the d file, or maybe even something like f4 f5 as a very sort of third option that exists here. So we get bishop d6, king g2 here, and now we get f6. One other point is now the bishop is threatening to capture on g7 because of the pin. So f6 is played by Hans. Now Magnus goes rook e4, guards the pawn on h4, also threatens to stack the two towers and win the knight on e6. Hans has to play f5 here. If he were to go king f7, white can now go bishop c4, and now you have a problem with this diagonal as well, and everything is falling apart. So Hans plays f5, Magnus plays rook c4, knight f4 check, king f2. Not Magnus, sorry, Hans plays bishop c5, which is a critical blunder, but again at this point it's already probably lost because now you have to deal with the fact that your g7 pawn is weak, nothing on the queen side is loose, and it's just very, very miserable. So Hans plays bishop c5, and now Magnus plays rook takes rook. Very nasty little tactic. Hans has to take back with the rook. He'd love to take with the pawn, but now there's bishop e5 hitting both the rook and the knight on c7 and f4 respectively. Also the bishop on b5 prevents the knight d3 fork. So rook c5 is played, we get bishop to b4, and now Magnus will get the material back here because he can take the rook next move. Knight e6 is played, Magnus takes, we get knight takes, obviously not pawn takes because now this a pawn again will be very fast after bishop c4, a5, a6, a7. So knight takes c5 is played, we get b4 here, knight e6, and now bishop c4. Again, there are many ways for white to win this, but the most important thing to think about here is that white has a 2-on-1, and eventually you want to start pushing this pawn up the board and distract black, and at some point then you can maybe even play on the king side. So knight d4 is played here by Hans. We get rook e1, king d6, rook to d1, king e5. Black cannot take on h4 because after king g3 there was an overload here that squares on e4 and g4 are covered by the pawn on f3. You can't go to f4 because I capture, and if you move the rook away I very simply capture your knight on d4. So king e5 is played, f4, king e4, only move obviously to keep the knight guarded. Now bishop f1, threatening to go bishop g2 and win the knight on d4. Hans goes king b5, and now Magnus plays a5, takes, rook b8, and now a6 here, and everything is falling apart. This passed pawn is too much to deal with, and additionally you also have this knight on d4 which isn't doing anything. So king c5 is played, we get rook c1, king d6, king e3. Hans plays knight c6 here, and now we get rook to c3. Again, many ways for white to win this. It really doesn't matter as long as you don't blunder this pawn, and eventually you get ready for bishop g2. So knight a7 is played, and now we get bishop c4, rook to e8, king to f3, rook to e7, and now we get rook e3. Simple move by Magnus, offering the exchange of rooks. If white did not have this a pawn, black would be able to draw, but black now has to deal with the fact that knight is preventing the pawn from pushing, and there are also ideas like bishop f7 to win the pawn on g6. So rook d7 is played, doesn't really matter. Rook d3 check, king c7. Magnus is able to trade the rooks anyway, and now after bishop f7 it all is falling apart. You can't really get to this a pawn in time, and I'm also going to be able to create the wide pipos with the passed h and the passed a pawns. Hans plays king c6, bishop takes, king b6, h5, knight c6, h6, takes. Now we have the classic wide pipos on h6 and a6, and Hans resigns here. The only try is knight e7, and if you were to play h7 after knight takes bishop, you prevent the pawn push. But white can play a couple of very elegant moves. I guess all three moves work on the diagonal, but bishop h5 looks like the nicest one here, and simply you're going to push the pawn and make a queen. Black goes knight g8, h7, h8. And without knight g6 here, let's say king a6, h7, you simply win because the knight can't stop the h-pawn, which is why Hans resigns in this position. Hans loses this game. He goes down 2-1 in the match. Magnus would go on to win the fourth and final game with the black pieces. Again, the score looks very big for Magnus with 3-1, but Hans was in a must-win situation, which is a large part of why he pressed so hard. It didn't work out for him, so it's a very, very tough start for Hans. Yesterday, he loses 3-0. Today, he starts off with a huge win against Magnus, but then he loses 3 games in a row again. So Hans has a lot of work to do, but it's still a very long event, and we'll see what happens in the coming rounds of the FTX Crypto Cup. I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap. Make sure to hit that subscribe button below if you have not already, and hopefully I will do more recaps for you guys. All right, see you.